Hi, my name is Skentelbery, and I am the Director General of 𝗷𝗵𝗂𝗀. Thank you very much indeed for joining us for this webinar, where we're going to take a deep dive into our recently published report from 𝗘𝗨'𝘀 Associates on the impact of the EU's General Pharmaceutical Legislation on Europe's innovation ecosystem and biotechnology companies. I'm delighted to say that we have almost 250 registrations for today, and we look forward to a really interesting discussion and conversation. So next slide, please. So this afternoon, we're going to run through the report itself, which was a very significant publication for us in January. I have a quick introduction to you before we get going, and then we will hand over to Tim and Antun from 𝗘𝗨'𝘀 Associates for a deep dive into the main points from the report, before we then move to a panel discussion and Q&A with the audience that really bring together the report sponsors and major 𝗷𝗵𝗂𝗀 members to look at how this impacts different aspects of their own innovation ecosystem. And we will wrap up probably by about 2:20. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start with a little bit of housekeeping. Delegates are invited to submit questions through the Q&A component of Zoom, and we will try and pick these up. If they are very technical in nature, we will direct them towards CRA. If they're more sort of discussion and philosophical, we will bring them to our panel to discuss. But we will try and answer as many questions as possible. So you are very much encouraged to submit questions through the Zoom app. Following the end of the webinar, this is being recorded, so we will share with our registrants the recording plus the slides, and we really look at this as a way to continue the conversation in the long term. We will publish and promote the outcome from the webinar and look forward to carrying on discussing the impact that the General Pharmaceutical Legislation has on all different aspects of biotechnology delivery. Next slide, please. So there's no such thing as a free lunch, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about 𝗷𝗵𝗂𝗀 before we get started, so that you can also understand the context of this webinar this afternoon. We are the cross-sectoral industry association championing biotechnology, and we really work across lots of sectors. We provide the voice of companies and the ecosystem through which biotechnology is developed and delivered, whether that is to patients, whether it's to consumers. We speak for everybody that's involved in the delivery of biotechnology. And we really have three main goals within the association. We talk about we have the aim to build biotechnology in Europe. So we look at the legislative, regulatory, and economic frameworks in which biotechnology is delivered, because this is incredibly important to enable the impact of biotech to be felt by all. We also have a goal to have biotechnology in view. It's incredibly important that people can see and understand biotechnology and how it is applied into their everyday lives, not only from a social perspective, but also an economic perspective, and how it supports the environment in which they live. And finally, we have a goal around biotechnology in action. Together with our members, we really work to help support the creation of skills and talent, the development of intellectual property, and of course, the investment that goes with the pathway from discovery through to market and application. Next, please. And we do this in a number of different ways. We have our three main councils, which is our advocacy engine of 𝗷𝗵𝗂𝗀. So we work very strongly through healthcare, which is how we are speaking to you today. We also have an industrial biotechnology council, which was where we really look at how biotechnology is driving the Green Deal and the industrial revolution towards biomanufacturing. And finally, we have our National Associations Council, which is a critical voice that's bringing regional and national voices together for the delivery of biotechnology on the ground. Because, of course, we speak about policy often at European level, but it's delivered nationally. And supporting these three councils, we have two amazing platforms. We have our SME platform, where we really bring the voice of small companies into the conversation, because they often have a very different perspective on their, and indeed timescale, for how they need to achieve. And it's very important that their voices are heard as much as everybody else. And finally, we have our biomanufacturing platform, which is a relatively recent development, but really allows us to look at biotechnology from the product back rather than the technology forward, so that we can really showcase how it plays a role within economies, within employment, within skills, within your consumer products and processes that you have. And it's been a very effective tool to demonstrate how biotech integrates into our everyday life. Next slide, please. So we have a wonderful community of members within 𝗃𝗧𝗃. We have our corporate members, many of whom you will meet today as part of this panel discussion. And these are really the innovators of products within biotechnology and really help to drive the core of our advocacy engine, because it's their products that will reach your shelves, make a difference to your lives. Next slide, please. We then have our national associations and bioregions, and I've already mentioned these are a critical voice in the conversation about biotechnology, because this is, as Europe strives to move towards a knowledge-driven economy, it is the role of these national and regional associations that help make that a reality, and they particularly nurture the environment where small companies can start up and grow and build partnerships. Next slide, please. And finally, we have our associate members, which also sit our small company members. And these are an incredibly important part of our expertise. Our small companies bring us really the voice of what biotechnology is going to look like next, as they are really the frontier organizations creating the translation between Europe's excellent research and market development. And it also is where we have our expert service providers, without whom people would not be able to develop innovative products through to market. So we're really a very rounded family for biotechnology within 𝗃𝗧𝗃. Next slide, please. And this really brings us to the topic of the webinar today. As I've mentioned, we published a very important report in January called The Impact of the EU's General Pharmaceutical Legislation on Europe's Innovation Ecosystem and Biotechnology Companies. And it's really important to understand what drove this. So the why. We saw that when the GPL was published last March, there was a real lack of insight into the impact on innovation across companies of different sizes and within a very complex innovation ecosystem. So we felt that this really needed to be drawn out and investigated so that policymakers could understand the potential consequences of certain aspects of the GPL. And how did we do this with the report? We worked with Charles River Associates, undertaking research and interviews across the whole biotechnology spectrum. Who we spoke to, we talked about across innovators of all company sizes. We talked to service providers, we talked to investors, and we talked to national associations, because these are really the organizations that reflect what the innovation ecosystem looks like within Europe and the potential impact of the GPL on each type of actor. And what did we do? Charles Rivers worked really hard to look at the impact of the GPL on different aspects of innovation, and particularly things that would impact investment decisions in innovators of all sizes, not just small companies, but growing and large-sized companies as well. And of course, then you can look at what the consequences are for changing decisions and investment around biotechnology. And we looked at these consequences from the same perspective as the Commission looked at the GPL. What does it want to achieve? We talk about more access for patients, we talk about greater competitiveness for Europe, and we wanted to be able to highlight the consequences of the GPL in its published form on patient access to medicines and Europe's competitiveness. And finally, the outcome. This was really about what we would like our report to help achieve is enabling Europe to be a global leader in biotechnology and patient access, particularly for next generation medicines, because this is incredibly important because it's where many medicines will now come from. So next slide, please. And my final point really is, why is this so important? It's because there are multiple reasons. Biotechnology is a strategic priority within the EU and the wider Europe. We see that the majority of future medicines will be delivered through biotechnology. It's also a frontier, it's a frontier sector. It is high risk, it's long term, it's making discoveries that will open up next generation medicines. So it's an incredibly important component of medicines development. It is also a global race, and this is driven very much by legislation. So if Europe wants to be a global leader, it needs to position itself with strong incentives and a really strong focus on how biotechnology can be matured from amazing European research grown through European companies, or at least companies based within Europe. And we know, and as you will know from 𝗷𝗂𝗪, small innovators in particular are a critical component of this. They drive research translation, so they really are at the beginning of the journey for advanced medicines. But all innovators are impacted by changes in legislation. So a change to one impacts everybody, and it can be very disruptive to the innovation cycle within Europe. And finally, I will make the point that biotechnology is often positioned as an emerging technology or a technology with potential. It is a technology that has already arrived. It already has a very significant economic footprint within Europe. 𝗷𝗂𝗪 has undertaken research with the 𝗲𝗺 Institute to show how biotechnology has supported and grown Europe over the last 20 years. So we undertook an analysis right back to 2008 with the most recent data from 2021. And we could say that, the gross value added for Europe from healthcare biotechnology, the increase since 2008 was 3.1% for healthcare biotech, compared to an EU average of just 2.1% growth. You see very strong employment growth linked to healthcare biotechnology, much higher than the EU average. It's an incredibly productive sector. You only need to look at the difference in those numbers of labour productivity, say 174,000 euros compared to 62,000 euros for productivity. And it's a strong export driver for Europe. It's the European exports from healthcare biotechnology grow at a much higher scale than the EU average. So this is a really important sector, and the General Pharmaceutical Legislation will shape what it looks like for the next 20 to 25 years. So it's incredibly important that we get this right. So next slide, please. So I am now going to hand over to the next phase of our webinar, which is handing over to Tim and Antun from Charles River, and they are going to talk you through the main points of the study that we have before us before we move to our panel discussion in sort of 25 or 30 minutes. So I will switch my camera off and be quiet, you will be glad to know, and hand over to Tim and Antun to take us through the next phase of the webinar. Thank you, Tim and Antun.
Brilliant. And thank you, Claire. That's a very good introduction. You covered many of the things that we wanted to touch upon in describing the background to this study. So I will go through the background at a high level, and then Antun, who managed the project from our Brussels office, will take you through some of the results. But we'll be monitoring the Q&A. We're looking forward to questions, and the more questions, the better from our perspective. So please ask questions as we go on. So if we move to the next slide, we know there are many reports on the GPL. The Commission themselves has done a lot of analysis. A lot of analysis preceded the publication of the proposal, and a lot has happened since. As Claire said, we wanted this report to add to the debate, to look at the parts of that we haven't investigated maybe as much as we think we should. So we were very much looking at the interconnections within the innovation ecosystem and the role of different size companies. And I'll say what we mean by that in a couple of minutes' time. So understanding the impact on different companies, but also the interaction between different types of companies, innovators, funders, researchers, etc., looking at how the ecosystem works together. So the project really had three aims in terms of investigation. One was to hear the voices of companies from different perspectives, involved in innovation at different stages, different sizes of companies, involved in innovation at different points in the life cycle. Then to understand the interaction that has in terms of funding. We know one of the big issues, and Antun will come back to this later on, is the funding landscape in Europe. So what will this do to venture capital's view of funding in innovative biotech? Will it actually lead to greater uncertainty? And where's the evidence for that? What's beyond the views we've got? Where can we actually look at some of the data on that? And then if we bring this back together and we look at the ecosystem as a whole, do we think this is of concern? Will this change the composition, or will it actually change the level of activity? So that was the aims of the study. If you go to the next slide, please. What did we actually do? Move on to the next one. A literature review. We were building on the shoulders of other people that have done research in this area. You won't find a huge, long literature review in this study. We know many of the people on this call today know the GPL very well. They know many of the reports that have come out over the last year. But we do set out the consequences of those reports and some of the hypotheses that we were looking to investigate. We then did quite a lot of data analysis. This was really trying to understand the role of different company sizes. So we were looking at orphan designation and how long does that take for different company sizes? What data exists at different stages of the life cycle? What role do companies play at different stages of the life cycle? So trying to add some quantitative data that targeted in terms of understanding the innovation ecosystem. And then probably the most important part, and probably the most time-consuming part for everyone involved, we spent a lot of time discussing this with senior executives at different sizes of companies, trying to, as Claire suggests, get that composition of different sizes of companies, but also understand the interaction between them and funders, venture capital, but also large mature companies that invest in smaller companies as well. So very much trying to understand the interaction between them. And here the National Biotech Association interviews, because they have an ecosystem perspective, were really, really useful. So, and probably quite a few of the folks that participated in that are on the call today. So thank you. That was very important. And it was the interaction of the views of experts and the quantitative data that we hope is compelling for this study. If you go on to the next slide, and this will be my last, one of the things that I suppose is our framework for the study, and we hope is slightly innovative and slightly new, is to say, well, we can't just talk about small. And we certainly can't just talk about SME. If you look at the SME definition that the European Commission have, many small biotech companies don't satisfy that definition. But we know they have very different circumstances to bigger companies. So from the outset of this, we needed a better framework, a better tiered structure. And this is what we came up with. We don't know it's perfect, but we certainly found it very useful for this study. So tier 1, small, probably quite recognizable from an SME perspective, don't really have mature products in late clinical stages, let alone marketed ones, probably would satisfy the European Commission definition. But if you move to small, and here we're talking about companies with a product in the late clinical trials, certainly wouldn't satisfy the conditions of being an SME. But I think most people on this call today would see them as small biotech companies, would have a very small geographical footprint. And then the last one was this mid-cap, this mid-sized companies, which quite close to the EIB definition. Here we probably have one product on the market, which probably is self-funding R&D, but probably doesn't have the geographical footprint of what we might think of as a mature company. So this was the structure we've used, and you'll hear Antun, as we go through, referring to these 3 different tiers. So we hope this is a legacy that goes beyond this report, because certainly we found it very useful. So Antun, I've built you up. What did we actually find?
Thank you, Tim. Yeah, maybe we should go to the next slide. Thanks. So I think it's important to start with setting out the scene. As Claire mentioned, is Europe a leader, and what actually policymakers are trying to achieve with what is now known as the most significant overhaul of the pharmaceutical legislation in the last 20 years. So starting with this point, we all know that for strong innovation ecosystem, we need strong scientific base, and we also need investments. So just for the purpose of this webinar, we would just like to highlight some of the findings that also builds on existing literature and recently published reports. So what we found that Europe is performing strong in terms of scientific base. So looking just, for example, on the number of biomedical publication in top tier journals, we see that Europe is rivaling with the United States. So here, I think it's important to differentiate the point of a European Union and Europe as a whole, including the well-known Golden Triangle in the UK, London, Cambridge, and Oxford, and also Switzerland. So what we also observe looking at the number of STEM graduates is that other regions are getting the momentum and building up their capacity. So although Europe still stands strong in terms of scientific base, other regions are building up and coming to compete with Europe. In terms of the investment perspective and what's happening on that stand, looking at the venture capital, we see that Europe is stagnating or even declining in its share of venture capital deals activity compared to other regions. And what is also interesting to see on the third graph, which presents venture capital funding share. And what is interesting to observe is the difference of the stages of clinical development where the investments actually happen from the venture capital point of, like from the venture capital investments in the US and Europe. What we observed that in US, more significant share of investments actually happen in earlier stages of development compared to Europe, where we see that investments happen for more later stages. So looking at both perspectives, scientific base and investments, this builds and this strengthens the message that funding is a challenge in Europe. There is also the point of fragmented venture capital market, but also fragmented point of getting investments and being listed, etc. Some of the additional points that were raised in the report. But is there an issue with the current situation? So we look at it as an example of one of the most innovative therapies. So looking at ATMPs and actually where science and investments merge and doing the clinical trials, what we observe that there is already a potential issue, and looking only at the clinical trial activity, we see that European Union is not at the forefront of innovation. So looking at the number of clinical trials for ATMPs in almost last 3 years, we see that US significantly outperforms Europe, and China is already stronger than Europe in terms of the overall number of clinical trials for ATMPs. So I think these are the factors that needs to be considered before our further discussion, because this sets up the scene and shows that policymakers needs to consider how to adapt and how to build a future-proof framework and to bring certainty and to ensure investors to invest in emerging small companies and biotech ecosystem in general in Europe. So maybe moving on to the next slide, please. So first thing we wanted to discuss as a finding from the report is the proposed change to the duration of orphan designation. So I think it's important to first look at what the graph on the left-hand side shows is what tier of company is applying for, or what company, at what stage of companies when applying for the orphan designation. And what we observed based on the data from 2018 to 2022 is that significant portions of more than 50–60% of companies actually applying for orphan designation are companies at the tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. However, when looking at the point of commercialization, we see significant difference, and we see that actually mature companies are the ones commercializing orphan medicine products. So why is this important? This is important because company size and the amount available for the progressing through clinical trials will impact duration between orphan designation and marketing approval. So looking at the data on the average number of years from when the company receives orphan designation to market authorization, we observe certain differences based on the size of the company. So just looking at the total for all companies of different tiers, we can assume that the length of 7 years would be enough on average across all tiers. But looking specifically on small companies, we see that the assumption that a cap of 7 years would potentially significantly impact these small companies because they won't be able to progress to the marketing authorization at that time. And also just making the point that these are the averages. So the Commission's assumption, we see, for example, at the point for mature companies, which could progress from orphan designation to clinical trials in less than 5 years. We understand the point from the Commission that 7 years, in theory, looking the averages could be enough. But looking more specifically at the tiers of company, we see a problem. This problem is even more significant when we observe the transfers of orphan designations from small company to mature companies and or mid-cap companies. Then this time between orphan designation and marketing authorization takes even longer. So the time depends on the size of the company because company has different availability of resources to progress through clinical trials. And the argument from the Commission that capping the orphan drug designation to 7 years will incentivize companies to progress through clinical phases earlier is based on our analysis flawed because companies are not deliberately postponing its clinical trial research, and putting the cap on 7 years could have significant impact on these companies because this brings uncertainties for investors if they lose or if they don't progress to marketing authorization in the allowed time. This could have a repercussion in terms of getting the orphan market exclusivity, etc. But also one point where we look at the what could be a potential impact on patients. So the products that took more than envisaged 7 years of the cap, we estimated based on the number of products that could potentially be impacted, what would be the size of patient population potentially receiving treatment, having delays in receiving the treatments, or even if the company decides not to invest or progress with clinical trials, that maybe this treatment won't even be available on European markets. So our estimate is around 1.9 million patients could be affected if this cap is, as it's made, arbitrarily implemented, and this would significantly impact small and emerging companies, because as we see for orphan diseases, they're extremely active in this space, especially at the time of orphan designation. So maybe let's move us to the next slide, where we wanted to show the impact on reducing the baseline for orphan market exclusivity. So as mentioned earlier, the emerging companies are, the significant portion of their portfolio is focused on orphan drugs, which is explained in the report on the way how they operate and what risk emerging company takes compared to the mature companies. Important to note is that significant portion of their portfolio is focused on rare diseases. And what does it mean for them if the baseline of orphan market exclusivity is reduced from 10 to 9 years? So this will significantly impact the estimation of the value for their future products. So this is specifically from the point of the investors. And as each investor builds the NPV models of net present value for the future asset, this reduction of the last year in orphan market exclusivity will have significant impact on the commercial value and estimation of potential returns on investments, which will impact the investor's decision to invest in these assets. There is also a challenge with, so these are the baselines and there are potential extensions. However, at the time of getting the orphan market exclusivity, many things will remain uncertain, and even more when investors are making investments in early stages of clinical development. They don't have they don't have the knowledge if a certain product will meet the criteria, for example, of high unmet need, or if the company will have a possibility to launch in all 27 member states. So this brings inherent uncertainty for investors and basically reduce their willingness to invest in these assets in Europe. Just going back to the point of high unmet need will be determined at the point of marketing authorization. So again, at the point when investors are making decision, this is uncertain, and basically investors won't take this into consideration. And also there is another point or perspective on the implementation of the high unmet need as a link to the duration of orphan market exclusivity is the impact on payers, because the payers could distinguish or differentiate orphan medicinal products on those who are targeting high unmet need or just unmet need. And this could have a significant impact on price, which then impacts the commercial value of the future product and also impacts the net present value for the investors. So reducing the baseline to 9 years has significant implications for future orphan medicines in Europe, and specifically for small emerging companies, as we see that significant portion of their portfolio is in focus on this area. Maybe moving us to the next slide. So similar findings we also observe for the reduction of the regulatory data protection, because investors, again, will take the baseline as given, and these additional uncertainties of meeting certain criteria would not be taken into consideration. Something to highlight here, this could specifically have impact on innovative technology. Just for example, to illustrate this is the example of ATMPs. So at the point of receiving the orphan designation, majority of companies who are active in this space, so which received orphan designation, more precisely, are companies so tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3, which slightly changes, then those who commercialize the ATMPs are actually mature companies. Why does it matter? It matters because for ATMPs, when we look at the patent duration, there is, due to significant development timeline, and as this technology's patent did the patent filing or the time when there was a patent priority review, it took significant time between this point and market authorization. So basically, based on our analysis of ATMPs from which were approved from 2018 to 2022, on average, these ATMPs would be left with 5.9 years of patent protection, and then the 6th year basically will equal with the patent protection. Therefore, this is just making the point that RDPs should be extended, because for most innovative technologies, we see that in many cases, patent can be filed early on, and there is a need to protect innovation with additional layers of IP rights. So the similar example was mentioned during the interviews for mRNA technology, which could similarly be impacted if RDP is limited only or shortened from 8 to 6 years. Maybe moving on to maybe just a point on this one is also that as the overall for OME and RDP, the reduction in baseline and reducing the incentive for investor to invest in this technology has also spillover effect on biotech clusters and national innovation, because this will diminish European region competitiveness, and this region would be less attractive for talent and companies, both homegrown and internationals. Further on, it will also have impact on supporting industries such as CDMOs and CROs, because they are all part of the ecosystem. And if one part of the ecosystem is affected, this has a spillover effect on other parts as well. So moving us to the next slide, where we wanted to also highlight some points on the positive elements of GPL, where we recognize, and through the interview program, it was recognized that streamlining the regulatory approval process is seen to be very beneficial. Also, the incentives for IMR is seen as a positive move. Also, the opportunity to have regulatory sandbox, improved digitization, it's all perceived well from the national associations, but also from the small emerging companies. However, it also needs to be taking into account that we need to look at who will actually benefit, for example, from the vouchers for novel antibiotics. It is recognized that emerging and small companies are the most active in this field, but also we need to take into account that not all SMEs or their proportion of their portfolio is focused on IMR specifically. So building on this point, just wanted to mention that Europe needs to improve its regulatory approval system, as it's currently lags behind. Reducing the timeline from 210 days to 180 days is seen positively. However, the question is if these changes will effectively come to fruition, because we know that current timelines are not in many cases respected. So although this is seen as positive, based on our analysis, we don't see that these positive proposals could actually offset the changes that I described earlier, and that specifically could impact the innovation ecosystem and investments in this innovation ecosystem. So the positive points from the streamlining the regulatory system, regulatory sandbox, digitization, that could actually be the offsets to reduced incentives for orphan medicines, reduced regulatory data protection, and other points that were raised, such as the capping the orphan designation period to 7 years. So although we want to acknowledge these positive proposals, based on our analysis, they won't be the offsets to the other negative proposals that would have impact on the overall ecosystem. So maybe moving us to the last slide, where we wanted to just make a summary of key conclusions that came up from our report. So European investment in innovation is falling behind from other regions. So something that I highlighted with the example of venture capital. This is also evidenced by the IPOs and in general weak capital sector in European region, specifically in the EU. So it basically creates that small and emerging companies needs to struggle through death of valley to actually deliver the innovation and to progress through clinical development. The reducing baseline incentives will add additional barriers for innovation in Europe. So basically this will depress the company startup, reduce investment, and what could be the consequence that innovators will seek opportunities in other markets. The offset proposed by the Commission, so this is in terms of specific allowances for SME, goes in line with the point that Tim earlier made, that potentially SME is not the right definition, because when actually company comes to the point of marketing authorization, maybe they won't fall in the Commission definition of SME, and the offsets and proposed additional provisions for SMEs would have very limited impact on supporting the innovation in Europe. So some historic strengths of Europe in rare diseases and novel therapies are at risk. This is illustrated with the point of what is happening with ATMPs. Europe is losing out in terms of the clinical trials, and something that Europe had a leverage upon other region is this 10 years of market exclusivity, which could de-risk the fragmented market access landscape. But as this reduction to 9 years, this brings additional uncertainties and basically weakens European position in the global race to bring investments in rare diseases to European region. Also, the biotech ecosystem could be damaged in terms of the point of interconnectedness and partnerships. So changes in the incentives, as mentioned in RDP and OMB, will cause that obtaining investment capital will be more challenging. This will reduce European attractiveness, European competitiveness with other regions, and reduce the opportunities for partnerships, collaborations between different stakeholders in the ecosystem, as mentioned, between different tiers of companies, between venture capital and other funders of the ecosystem. And maybe just a last point that I wanted to mention is that all these findings leads to the point that there is a perception that Europe is deprioritizing biotech innovation and competitiveness in healthcare. So, as mentioned, some proposals from the GPL are perceived as positive. However, taking the whole package into account, this doesn't offset changes made in the incentives, so in the reduction of OMP and or RDP, and in general, the overall message is that increased uncertainty for investors, so either venture capital, mature companies, and others, basically could put Europe behind other regions. Something that was also illustrated through in the report, even not thinking only in the early stage investments, but also in the impact of actually patient accessing this innovation. Is Europe still be the second market to launch? This is something under the question. And with these proposals put in place, the main point could be at the patient access and basically limiting European patients to accessing innovative treatments. So thank you very much. I will pause here, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much indeed. And that was an amazing presentation of what is, it's an incredibly large and complex report. So well done for managing to distill it down into a sort of 25-minute webinar contribution. It was no small achievement. And it's a really interesting, there's so much to take from this report. You know, we really look at how the fragility of the way that biotech is able to grow and how it is really driven by the legislative landscape in which it sits. And certainly right now, with the trajectory of Europe that we have in terms of declining clinical trials, for example, we're at a point where the GPL can make a really big difference. But what difference it's going to make depends on what the GPL finally settles as. And we see that, you know, you made the really clear representation of the fact that different organizations of different sizes are impacted in different ways. So it's not just a one size fits all in terms of how vulnerable they are to legislative changes. But as we said at the beginning, though, if you impact one innovator, you impact them all. If a large company moves away from a particular disease area, small companies have nowhere to go with their interesting technologies. They don't have the partner. And if small companies move away from areas, or if they're not able to start up, that innovation is not flowing through the pipeline to be amplified by larger companies later. So it's an incredibly important thing to get right. But we do have a couple of questions for you, which I will read out now, and you can decide whether you would like to take them or you would prefer them to be kicked into the panel discussion. So we've got a question from Catherine, which says, can you explain how a low early stage activity and a high number of biomedical publications occurs in Europe? So essentially, why do we have so many publications, but not seeing it translate into early stage commercial activity?
I can have a go, and Tim, you can jump in. So I think this is the main reason for a high number of publications is linked with the point of strong scientific base that Europe historically has. But going back to the point on looking specifically at the EU and Europe as a region where it has like this strong foundation in the UK, So historically, it was always said that Europe is the leading region in terms of biotech science. But if we separated EU from the EU region and separated the UK, then the numbers are a little bit different. But basically, Europe still stands comparative to other, like specifically US. The point on high number of publication is a strong scientific base and strong support for science. And the point why we don't see the transition between the early stage research and the innovation occurring or later stages, I think this is already well-established link in the literature of missing this link between academia and actual implementation in the industry. So basically, I think this is the message also from the report, that it's hard for startups to strive in Europe. So to progress through clinical trials, so there is a strong science, but then to have a startup to progress through different tiers and stages of development, it's hard, because it's hard to attract capital in Europe. And then with these changes where your future commercial value of the asset will potentially even be decreased, it will become even harder. So I hope this answers the question, but also happy for Tim to add if any points I missed.
No, that's great. I mean, it's a really good point, and it's long been a challenge in Europe. You know, we have a really amazing science base, but you cannot get past the harder market, the harder investment climate for small companies across. It's also across 27 different countries. It's not one single investment market. It's 27, and you often see national, very national focal points, particularly on public early stage VC, which of course means that you see that focus within relatively small territories. But we have another question as well. It says from Malak, given the proposed changes in orphan market exclusivity, how do you anticipate the return on investment for orphan medicinal products being affected within multinational pharma companies? Is that something that you want to comment on, Tim and Antun?
Maybe I'll take this one. We thought about this quite a lot, and obviously some of the other studies that have been done have put some quantification on the impact of the NPV and the impact on the number of products. I suppose as far as this study was going, as we were focusing on the why and that it would be significant. So I think we go as far as it would have a significant impact, and that seems to be agreed from multiple participants in the value chain and the data, but we haven't quantified it.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, we can also just look ahead at this. This will come out in the data that comes when we see how much companies are investing into the rare disease space and the number of products that we see coming to market, whether they're developed within Europe or introduced into a European market. So I think that the stats will out, but obviously we would really like to see those numbers are going up rather than down. But I think this brings us to the end of the initial presentation from the Charles River team. And thank you very much indeed, Antun and Tim. It was a huge lift throughout half of 2023, at the beginning of 2024, to get such an amazing report into the public domain. And the hard work was very much appreciated and extremely valuable. So thank you very much, gentlemen. We're now going to move to our panel discussion section of the webinar. So I'm going to ask our esteemed panelists if they can put their cameras on, and we will start with a round of introductions. And really the driver behind this panel discussion is to look at the different aspects of innovation for biotechnology and how they manifest themselves towards patient access, towards economic development within Europe. And each of our panel members has a slightly different perspective and a slightly different area of interest and the topic they would like to champion. So what we will do is we will have a rapid fire roundtable where they can introduce themselves and what they represent. So I'm going to start with Wojciech. If you just would like to say hi and introduce yourself, Wojciech.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I hope you can hear me fine. My name is Wojciech Nowak. I'm a Senior Director, Global Public Affairs at Novartis. And I also have a pleasure of chairing the Europa Bios Healthcare Council.
That's wonderful. Then I will skip over to John.
Hi, I'm John Ricketts from Lilly. I cover European government affairs. And I'm particularly interested in the elements here that drive the regulatory reform and the wider ecosystem that we've touched upon between public-private partnerships, particularly other parts of European regulations. The HTA regulation is one that is front of mind at the moment, just to give one example.
Thank you very much. And then we have Noel.
Yes, hi everyone. My name is Noel Minnis. I'm an EU Public Affairs lead at Takeda, and today I'll be focusing on the OMP regulation, its revision, and the rare disease ecosystem.
Lovely. Then I skip over to Yordan.
Hello everyone, my name is Yordan Aleksandrov. I'm a senior manager at Pfizer, and I'm also delighted to be co-chairing the 𝗘𝗺𝗀 OMP working group.
Lovely. And then we have Tom.
Yeah, good afternoon. My name is Thomas. I'm working for PTC Therapeutics, which is, according to Tim, Tier 3 company. And I am head of government affairs and patient advocacy for the EMEA region, and I'm a 𝗘𝗺𝗀 board member.
Thank you very much. And finally, Tineke.
Hi, thank you, Claire. Hello, everyone. Tineke van Hooland. I'm the Deputy Secretary General of 𝗃𝗀𝗶𝗃𝗀, which is the Belgian National Association advocating for a lot of companies, both large but also lots of SME companies. So representing the SME voice today. And I'm also chairing the National Associations Council, one of the three councils, as nicely explained by Claire, where we sit together with all our national associations and think upon how we can provide ideas and proposals to our policymakers to make sure that we can continue to innovate, but also produce here in Europe.
Thank you very much, Tineke. So we're going to jump straight into the questions for our panel linked to the report. And I'm coming straight back to Wojciech. You were really coming into this webinar and into this report as a champion of competitiveness. So I'm going to ask you, what do you mean by competitiveness within biotechnology for healthcare? And what do you think will change in Europe's competitiveness with the proposed GPL?
Yeah, thank you very much, Claire. So first of all, let's face it, and I think the CRA colleagues were very clear about it. Europe has been losing its competitive edge in biotechnology for the last 2 decades. I mean, it's a fact. And in the current geopolitical situation, just to bring this context, Europe is more than ever between West and East. So if you wish, Europe is more than ever between the innovation made in the US and innovation made in China. So from that perspective, Europe needs to ask itself the question what it wants to be. And here, the most critical part would be whether Europe would like to be innovation hub of the world or just a follower. And then if follower, do we really want to rely on innovations coming from the other geographies? And from taking this whole geopolitical context, perhaps the good aim is actually to restore the biotechnology innovation in Europe, which is fully in line with the concept of strategic autonomy. So the picture is not very rosy. Let me just maybe quote few data points of that one across the value chain, and just to comment and add to colleagues from CRA. So if you look at the financing, which is the very beginning of the needs pyramid of the research, funding could be coming either from public or private sources. So from the public sources, if we think about it, actually 4 biggest European Union's economies plus European funds is only a quarter of what US spends for medical research. Then if not public, then maybe private, and we discuss also the VC funding. And from that perspective, China receives 5 times more support, and US receives 9 times more VC funds for medical research than Europe. Then clinical trials, we've been also discussing that. From the global perspective, of course, the #1 country is US, then followed by European Union, and then China is the 3rd one. But if we look at the dynamics of the development, I think that the dynamics is the most interesting part. China actually has grown in an incredible way. China has doubled their clinical trials market in 5 years, not 20 years, but 5 years. And if this trend continues, actually in the next 5 years, China is going to take over Europe. Then the registration procedures. I think it's not a big secret to anyone on this call that Europe is much slower in terms of marketing authorizations and lags behind, EMA lags behind FDA with more or less 1/3 of the delay. And actually here on that, unfortunately, there are some good ideas on how to make this process smoother. And last but not least, probably the most striking one, Europe has a huge problem with absorbing the innovation. So the average US patients can access the treatment 2 times quicker than the average European patient. And this is pretty striking because we're speaking here innovation. And any innovation, if not made available to the patients, is basically useless.
No, I think that is a really bold point, because of course you don't, regardless of all the amazing R&D we do, you don't have a product until somebody uses it or it makes a difference. It doesn't matter. And so you made some really great points as well on the Europe, some of Europe's historical strengths. To remain an R&D hub is not necessarily a given, especially when you look at how quickly other areas of the world are developing. Just because we were good at something does not mean to say that we are going to remain good at it. And I think there's often a great deal of focus put on Europe's wanting to be or wanting to remain a scientific centre of excellence, but that is not guaranteed if you do not have the industrial pipelines attached to that. It will inevitably go where the industrial pipelines go. So thank you very much indeed for that opening statement, Wojciech. It really sets the scene. I'm going to move over to Don at Lilly, and we talk about a bit more about R&D here. So why does R&D for medicinal products need to happen within Europe? And how does this practically impact European patients?
Yeah, no, thank you, Claire. I mean, I think the most fundamental point of all that impacts everybody is the importance of strong and predictable intellectual property. That's what drives the innovation and the innovation in Europe. And therefore, putting that at risk by making it conditional is not a good starting point. But we do have a strong public-private partnership, and the GPL is our opportunity to get this right. So one of the first things is around using our science base and knowledge to provide early scientific advice for technology developers of whatever size, be that in terms of medicines, devices, diagnostics, or also now in the EU HTA space. And what we need there is sufficient funding to provide that capacity to do the job. And that's one of the bottlenecks that we certainly have at the moment. There is insufficient resource going into the EMA and into the EU HTA process, down to the national HTA bodies, to ensure that we can move faster and more rapidly and capture this opportunity that's there before us. And then Wojciech has touched on the clinical trials footprint, and so does CRA, and it's very stark in terms of ATMPs. And cell and gene therapy is exciting. It is the future. And therefore, Europe absolutely needs to embrace that and be a part of it. And at the moment, it takes over 100 days to get a clinical trials plan approved here in Europe. It's 30 days in the US. And as we've already heard, Europe now has about 20% of the clinical trials around the globe. A decade ago, it was 25%. So we need to build that back up. And why wouldn't we do that? It's good for clinical research. It's good for public-private partnerships. It's good for retention at member state level in healthcare systems of our leading clinicians. And most importantly, it's the first step in enabling patients to get access to cutting-edge innovation. And then when we look at the EMA, we touched on the speed and the flexibility. Yes, the 30 days timeline from 210 to 180 is very welcome. The bureaucratic technical gap between the CHMP and the central marketing authorization, the average 67 days down to 46 days, again, is welcome, but that's still going to mean that we're behind our colleagues in the US in the FDA. And most importantly, on the cutting edge technology where we want expedited pathways, The timeline that's being proposed at the moment is stuck at the 150 days that it is today. The EMA does about 10% of applications by an expedited, accelerated pathway. In the US, it's 70%. So we do need those extra resources. And then finally, this piece around the EU HTA. If the EMA is going to go faster, which patients need it to do to get the innovation faster, then the EU HTA needs to be in tandem with that. And has it got the resources? Can it do the job in the timeline, or is it going to be simple, straightforward, streamlined to speed that innovation, or is it actually going to be delay and a block? And that's a big concern at the moment, particularly for the first wave of products, which again is ATMPs and oncolytics. Next January, this system needs to be up and running and needs to be slick and swift.
Thanks very much indeed, John. And indeed, you make two really good points. The strength and predictability of the intellectual property system is a backbone to a technology such as biotechnology, because you are looking at potential medicines 10, 15 years in the future. You need to have a clear line of sight. And for an innovative first generation of products, there is no downside to increasing the protection that you can give to that. And I think your comment also links very much to Wojciech's as well about the ability to absorb innovation. Where the institutions are underfunded, that is an indicator of an inability to absorb innovation. And it doesn't really matter where the bottleneck is. We know that bottleneck is not the science. It's never the science. It's the pathway that the science must go along. And I guess ironically with the GPL, these things are all fixable. These are not things that are insurmountable at all. So I'm going to move now to Noel at Takeda, because you work more in the orphan space. And so I wanted to ask you how the current framework for orphan medicines has brought about successful innovation in rare diseases. And what was the situation like before legislation was in place for orphan medicinal products?
Yes, great. Thank you. Thanks, Claire. And as you already touched upon, I would like to take the opportunity to take a step back and really look at what we are actually discussing at the moment. So when we look at the revision of the current framework for orphan drugs in Europe, I think we all must first recognize that the OMP framework that is currently in place has been a true European success story. The current framework, no doubt, has brought successful innovation to rare disease patients across Europe. And I think to fully understand the impact that has happened, we should compare the situation we're in today with the situation we've had a bit more than 20 years ago before the legislation was in place. So before the OMP regulation 141 in the year 2000 was introduced, the landscape of rare disease research was characterized by very limited research. There was not much going on. And I know Yordan later on will focus on the topic in more details, but there are a number of challenges when conducting research in the field of rare diseases. But today, more than 20 years after the orphan regulation has come into force, I think we can clearly say that it has stimulated the development of new treatments for many, many patients living with previously untreatable rare diseases. And it has done so by providing protocol assistance, reducing fees for regulatory activities, additional incentives for SMEs, and with 10 years of market exclusivity for approved OMPs. And I think that's something we should really work towards maintaining. And I was talking about the success in the beginning, and I think the success can be measured by the fact that 20 years ago, we had like a handful. We had 8 authorized treatments for rare disease patients in Europe. And today we have more than 200. I think that's a clear trend that we can see, but also the rare disease ecosystem has improved and advanced a lot. Clinical trials in rare diseases have increased a lot. We have seen that earlier. We have 24 European reference networks established across more than 300 hospitals in 26 member states of the EU. I think that's something that's really strong. And at the same time, the awareness amongst national governments has increased. I mean, we have a lot of national rare disease plans, countries following up, just like Sweden currently working on a new one. So there is momentum still there. And it also boosted Europe's economy. We've seen that in the presentation by CRA. It has led to the creation of more than 200 SMEs who are responsible for roughly half of all orphan medicinal products in Europe. So I think that's something that we should definitely recognize. But at the same time, we all know that there's still a lot that needs to be done when it comes to treatments and incentivizing research in underserved areas, right? 95% of rare diseases, we all know that, don't have a treatment. A majority of rare disease patients only receive symptomatic treatment. And we believe that only when we work in partnerships to speed up development of innovative medicines, we can really also boost basic research and bring more innovative mechanisms to the market through public-private partnerships, for example, like John has laid out also. And the same goes for finding ways to faster diagnose patients. I think we need a strong collaboration among all stakeholders to really accelerate not only medicine discovery, but also to have stronger leverage of mechanisms for faster diagnosis. So I think we should really take a step back, see what we have created, that there is momentum still there, and even the ecosystem is keeping up at the same time, and we shouldn't jeopardize that success.
No, thank you. And I think that's a really good point to make, because your point about 20 years ago there were hardly any medicines available. That was a symptom of a market failure, because there's with rare disease, there's simply not enough people to enable investment into a drug. It needed significant legislative support, and it doesn't mean, and you have so many things in place now, which is wonderful. You talked about the partnerships, the rare disease net, the reference networks, but there's still market failure underpinning that. And so change the legislation too far away, and it's going to result in fewer drugs going into the pipeline again. You built the market, but you can easily take away the market, and the legislation is what does that. So thank you very much for that. And as you referenced as well, we're going to move over to Yordan now from Pfizer and talk about why innovation in rare diseases is so complicated and why it's so important that the ecosystem has so many different and diverse actors.
Thank you, Claire. I think I'll start from my recommendation, actually, because I think it falls very nicely with what Noel was saying and your points, Claire. I think that at the end of the day, the pharmaceutical legislation does need to reflect the particularity of the rare disease space. This is a space where innovation is quite complicated and complex because of a number of reasons: lack of knowledge, severity of disease, limited patient population. And because of this, and for us to have something to drive innovation towards unmet medical need, we do need to have something to counterbalance this complexity. This is what the OMP regulation, as Noel was saying, worked quite well, because it provided a regulatory framework with the incentives to counterbalance the uncertainties of the R&D environment in rare diseases and the complexity of the entire space. So weakening incentives framework and introducing more uncertainties is particularly at the beginning of the development process, is going to just present a further risk, not only for developers, but also for investors, as Antun was referring to at the beginning of the webinar, because the investors are going to have a tough time to successfully evaluate their investment. And we have seen also in the last few years that there is a tendency that investors pick more and more late-stage de-risk opportunities in comparison to early-stage projects. And from all of this, it is going to be the emerging companies, the small companies, which are going to suffer, which need the constant cash flow and which need these investments. In the rare disease space, this is extremely important because we already mentioned that the SMEs and emerging biotechs, they are the incubators of innovation in rare diseases. They are the ones driving innovations. Of course, we know that few of them are able to commercialize medicines, and it is much more much more common to enter into partnerships, but it is much more common to enter into partnerships specifically because of the particularity of the space and the complexity of the space. Because in a partnership, this field allows for both parties or all stakeholders to share risk, share responsibility, share investments, and also be able to share knowledge. So when this important part of the R&D ecosystem is shaken, it affects the entire R&D ecosystem. It affects the product development, but also it affects patients at the end of the day. To be a bit more illustrative, and I think Antun also referred to this at the beginning, modulation based on high unmet medical need, launch conditionalities, or potential extension of orphans. These all present uncertainties, and as such, they present risk, thus not taken into account when decision-making processes are underway. So the end of result is that small biotechs, they have they have less ability to attract investment, which is so important for them and so important for the development processes. So if we are serious about leaving no patient behind, I think we need to work towards an environment where innovation can thrive at scale, an environment which is able to counterbalance the complexity and the uncertainty of a high-risk R&D space.
Thanks very much indeed, Yordan. And your points about the interconnectedness of the ecosystem as well are really relevant, because when I started my career sort of in the early 2000s within biotech, there were fundamental changes to the ecosystem with many of thousands of small companies springing into life, particularly around unique areas of science. And that also changed the structure and behavior of larger companies as well. So this is not about a small number of large companies being able to do this. Everybody is intertwined now, and it's a fundamental element of the ability to take medicines through to patients. But I mean, speaking of smaller companies, we're going to step across to Thomas now from PTC. And we've heard from some bigger companies here that the GPL would already pose some significant issues. Tell us how this will disproportionately affect you as a smaller innovator.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. Indeed, as I said before, if you heard in the presentation, we're a tier 3 company, apparently, according to CRA. So we're PTC is a mid-sized biopharmaceutical company. We're not sort of small, but we're also not a major multinational. So we're right in that middle spot, I would say. And we're developing therapies for people with rare diseases using very novel technologies, biotechnologies like RNA splicing and gene therapies. We are a global company, but based in the US. And I'm mentioning those elements because those elements color our views through sort of 3 lenses, if you want, right? So mid-size, indeed, is very important to highlight. I think it was said before. That already means we have, certainly also in Europe, more limited resources. And I come back to that, what that means. We focus on rare diseases with highly innovative therapies. And as I said, those are a very particular elements, as I think as other speakers like Noel and Yordan have said. And there is no one size for all, which sometimes you get a little bit the impression that the GPL tries to do. And the other thing is, yes, we are a global company, but we're based in the US. So, people that make very important business decisions view the EU from outside in, not from inside in. And I think that's also very important to realize, because some of the facts that I think Wojciech, for example, mentioned, these are facts known by senior management of whether you're a mid-sized company or a large company, and they look at the world through indeed a global lens and see where business can flourish. So I wanted to start off saying, of course, repeat a little bit what was said before, but start off on the positive side, right? So I do think the GPL does contain some positive elements, and I think as John has mentioned, there are some improvements. I think the issue with that is more that they are all on the regulatory side, right? So they're really meant to fix or improve the regulatory approval system, and at the same time also they of course, try to catch up with other regulatory systems around the world. So that in itself is a good development. The other is a rare disease company where the voice of the patient is extremely important, even more important probably than in other disease areas. We also think it's very important that the voice of the patient is more recognized in the EMBA, so that patients really get a more formal involvement in committees like the CHMP. I think that's a good development, and let's see how that pans out. But sort of, as I said, these are on the regulatory side, whereas a company, also as a smaller company, you look at it and say, okay, how does the European Commission with their changes try to promote access and innovation in Europe, right? And what are the effects on a mid-sized company? And there, of course, I think it's a bit more challenging and not so good as other speakers have already said. And almost like if you step back and don't go into the details, but you indeed, as I said before, you take a sort of 5,000 miles view on this from this. Let's say you sit in the US. I think you get the impression that Europe is very contradictory, actually, right? So on the one hand, you see a lot of proposals that the Commission comes forward and countries as well, like France, etc., basically aiming to attract investments, whether it's in R&D or manufacturing, the biomanufacturing proposals, etc., that are on the table, where 𝗷𝗃 is also quite involved in. So these are all very, very important and very positive. But then, of course, if you look at the policy proposals or legislative proposals, again, not going into the details, whether, like if it's 8 years or 9 years or 10 years market exclusivity, the net result is that you give the impression to the rest of the world that the incentives and other elements are going to be reduced, right? And as was said already before, it looks as if Europe is less interested in promoting this. There's this, as I said, this contradiction on the one hand, wanting to have R&D and manufacturing, but then don't really want to stimulate more access and more innovation in Europe. And we see that as a smaller company as well. So as a smaller company that, of course, has clinical trials running in Europe, but the R&D and manufacturing are definitely in the US, because we don't have the ability to set up sites everywhere. If you are faced with that kind of situation in Europe, where you give this signal that maybe you are less interested in downstream activities, that has a negative impact on these kind of decisions. The other element, which I didn't hear so much from other speakers, is that yes, it has as was said, it has a negative impact on R&D, manufacturing, etc. But we also think that when new therapies are being developed in other regions of the world, whether it's the US or increasingly in China, etc., the net result will also be that these products, new therapies, will be launched later in Europe. It's not so much I don't think the risk for Europe is not having access to it, because the reality is, of course, that this is a large region with many patients that have very large needs. The risk that I think I see far more is that it's around the question, when do you get access to it? And if the environment is not very conducive to launching products, it simply will mean that global companies, whether they're small or large, but also smaller like ours, will, of course, have a harder look at Europe in terms of timing. When do you want to launch a new therapy? Or maybe that other region in the world will have a priority. I think that is a big risk that also in other discussions apart from today is not getting across very well, certainly with the EU institutions. And
thanks very much indeed, Tom. So I think, sorry, did you want to finish?
No, let me just finish on two things, because one is more for mid-size, and it was said, I think, already by others as well. Some of the proposals, like the market launch obligations, are just not very feasible for smaller companies, just from a capacity point of view, or they're very inappropriate, right? If you deal with novel technologies like gene therapies that have to be administered in specialized treatment centers that are not available in all countries, or where patients are not available or not present in all countries. And then finally, just the final word is that, and again, it was said before, but I think it's disproportionately important for mid-sized and smaller companies, is this level of uncertainty. As Noel had said before, the current regulation is not only has generated huge benefits, but also if you look at it, is very stable. It's very predictable. It's, you know, everything in there. There's no modulation in there. There's no uncertainty in there. And once you get these incentives, for example, like the beginning, you know what's will happen. This kind of modulation and granting unmet medical needs status, etc., at the later stage will just create uncertainty that again will affect all pharma companies, but I would say disproportionately smaller companies that have a more limited portfolio. So yeah, maybe I'll leave it there. Thanks.
No, that's perfect. And you make a lot of really good points. You know, you talk about high level versus legislation. You know, Europe talks the talk at high strategic levels, but then it's the legislation that has to walk the walk, to use a phrase. And we're not seeing that at the moment. We're not seeing, and we see that in other sectors as well. It's not just healthcare. You know, it's the legislation that creates the reality on the ground for the delivery of biotechnology. So I'm going to go as quickly as possible now to Tineke, who has been joining and leaving fairly consistently for the last 10 minutes. So I'm going to ask you my question while you are here, hopefully. So,
yes, I hope the line stays stable. So here we go.
Yes.
Yeah.
So thanks very much, Tineke. So you really represent a country that has really made the most of investment into biotechnology. You know, Belgium has really performed incredibly well. And so beyond pure biotech innovation, how has Belgium development into a hub? How has Belgium developed into a hub for medicines, and how has it changed the country?
Yeah, so the development of a hub, that's basically a work for more or several decades, let's say. So just a little bit of history very quickly. When we look back at Belgium has always had a scientific strength, let's say, with many universities, and it goes back to 1911 when there was a first Solvay conference organized in Belgium where a lot of scientific people were invited by Ernest Solvay, and that was kind of the start, if we can call it like that, of the science hub. And then when we look at the 50s and the 60s, there were many investments, industrial investments by foreign companies in our country, like Baxter, like GSK, but also Johnson & Johnson started to develop its, let's say, industrial activities. Due to the fact that we have the presence of many large companies like Novartis, like Takeda, and many more, it has led to the creation of an ecosystem. So many startups and spin-offs have been created thanks to the strengths as well of the bigger companies. So it's kind of a dialogue which is going on between, let's say, the academic world and between the bigger companies, which then leads to the creation of hubs. And we have 4 of them in Belgium, 2 in Flanders and 2 in Wallonia. Added to that is the strong support that we have of our governments, both from the regional governments, also from the federal government. And for many years now, we are also in a dialogue and a consultation platform, which is the R&D bio platform under the premises of our Prime Minister. And all of that adds to the fact that today we are the health and biotech valley, as we call it ourselves within Europe. But there are many red flags, and we also see what is happening in the US, like the Inflation Reduction Act. We see the speed that is happening in China as well. So we need to make sure that as Europe, we can continue to be in that Champions League. And it's true that as Belgium, we have, as you correctly said, we have created that hub. But we need to make sure that we can continue to have that hub and that we can continue to have that in Europe as well. And that indeed the innovation is needed, but also the industrial part that is needed. Now, what we need in Europe is rules that empower innovation and not rules that would kill innovation.
That is a perfect answer. Thank you very much indeed. And we could talk about this all day, and we frequently do. So I'm going to whiz around the group again now with our sort of second and wrap-up questions to leave people with really strong take-home messages and something that we feel very strongly that we'd like to see. So Tineke, if you were an MEP for Belgium, what would you want to do now? What would you say?
Yeah, well, I will summarize it in 3 words. So first of all, simplify. Simplify the complex. Less rules, of course we need rules, but they need to be impactful and they need to empower innovation. 2, harmonize. When we look at the funds, there are many funds in Europe that support innovation, which is a good thing, but sometimes for smaller companies, it's a jungle. So we should not have a jungle, we should have a nice forest, let's say. And I saw on one of the slides that also in terms of venture capital, we are sometimes seen as a dead valley. So let's make sure that we are alive and kicking in that space as well. And the 3rd element is invest. Invest in innovation, invest in production. There's a new initiative coming up, which is a European Biotech and Biomanufacturing Initiative. Let's make sure that this becomes reality so that from the initiative, we can go into action. That is what I would do.
Perfect. I'm going to work my way back up the list to Wojciech to end with. So I'll go back to Tom now and say, Tom, what do you need to be able to reach more rare disease patients?
Yes, a couple of things. One is, I think, I haven't mentioned before, I think the European Commission tries to, with the European legislation, try to improve access at the national level. And I think that's not probably the best way to do it. So first of all, I was really separate, European legislation and how to improve the regulatory system, for example, versus access discussion, which I really think should happen more at the national level. The European Commission can play a coordinating role, but it should really be a dialogue at the national level. Second, I would try to see if the legislation can still change as much as possible to take out the elements that cause the uncertainty, as we said before, right? The modulation, etc. You can have that, but then it should really modulate upwards from what we have at the moment, not downwards, and then see through various obligations to move it up again. So if that can be done, and there are other elements as well. So take out the elements of uncertainty in the current proposals would be very helpful.
Excellent, thank you very much. And I'll go back up to Yordan. And so what would you have as an ask, a takeaway to policymakers for the GPL now?
So I'll make a message specifically for rare disease, a little bit building on what Thomas was saying. For me, the underlying point here is to have a bit of a more of a visionary perspective when this pharma package is being revised right now. Let's look at what has worked well in the past and what hasn't, and build on it, rather than do a step back, as Thomas is saying, and then include different types of conditionalities or just adding more uncertainty to a high-risk area. And yeah, let's have a simple and predictable system of incentives to encourage more R&D to the rare diseases.
Lovely, yes, because I think I've heard the comment before. It's like we've got the modulation and the conditionality as a carrot, but it's a very stick-shaped carrot in the way that it's been applied in here. So I'm going to work back up now to Noel. And so, what should the signal be that is sent from the GPL to the rest of the world in orphan diseases? What should it be to champion orphan diseases?
Yes. I repeat myself here, but I would say it again. Please don't jeopardize the success that the OMP regulation has brought, but rather, as had been said before, build on its momentum, strengthen the incentives framework, and make it robust and predictable. I think that's most important, and that will send the signal to the world that we, as Europe, are still very strongly focused on bringing innovation to patients.
Perfect. And John, what should the GPL do differently to make sure that innovation and clinical trials do happen and do go back up in the EU?
So I think, again, big picture, Tineke touched on it. We need an industrial strategy for biotechnology. We need to make sure that we have the financial resource, public and private, into the EMA, EU HTA, and particularly on the private side, we need to unlock venture capital to drive the ecosystem forward. Then, as Thomas was saying, we absolutely need this foundation of strong and predictable IP coming out of the GPL. At the moment, there's no certainty, and everybody's therefore assuming that the baseline is going down. That would be a very negative message to send out to the rest of the world. And then finally, again, Thomas touched on this, patient access is critical. Everybody in our laboratories in discovery, they don't come to work to have a nameplate that they discovered something. They want that innovation to get through to the patient. But trying to create some artificial link between IP and access is sending out a very negative message. We need to tackle this at a member state level. It's a member state competency. It's multifactorial. We need to work country by country to make sure that there's more equitable, faster access right through the whole life cycle system, and it gets to patients faster.
That's wonderful. And so finally, we'll come back to Wojciech as the chair of our healthcare council within 𝗃𝗃. And so wrapping up, Wojciech, what would you say, what's your vision for a competitive Europe? Let's look 10 years in advance. And how is the GPL going to achieve this?
Yeah, thank you very much, Clara. So I think on the very top of the pyramid is the bold strategic decision. It's a bold strategic decision on what Europe wants to be and how to make Europe this innovation hub of the world. I think this is on the very, very top. And it sort of falls into three pillars, if you wish, or three categories. The first one is not breaking what works. So if the IP system works, it delivers on expectations, let's maintain it. Let's not break what works. The second one related to that is predictability. Breaking this is not fixing the issue, it's just bringing more problems. And thirdly, I think it's basically about employing right tools for the job. If the access is said to be the issue, let's not try to fix this with tools which will not work, like reduction of RDP.
Now, I think I was busy writing all of those things down, and they're all completely correct. And I think if we were going to taking away from the discussion today, there are no downsides for patients or economic development from incentivizing biotechnology, because it is such a frontier technology. It requires the stability, it requires the predictability, and the beneficiaries are the patients at the end of the day. The harder we make this, the fewer patients are going to gain access to what we are able to develop. And I think that's such a fundamental principle to keep in mind. And you've all also made critical points about the right tools for the job, and also the right levels at which to apply those tools, whether they're EU tools or whether they are member state tools. You know, we've all pointed out where you see different bottlenecks in the system, and they are all solvable, but they're not necessarily solvable by making conditions for innovation harder. That is not going to get you past bottlenecks at the EMA or a member state. But we've had a fantastic discussion, and we've had some nice questions from the audience. We'll wrap up now, and I would like to say a huge thank you to all of our panelists for their really hard work. I would like to say thank you to CRA for the excellent study. We will follow up with all participants to make sure you have a copy of the study, and indeed a lot of the supporting documents that we also use within our work. And we will make sure that you have everything you need to continue the conversation. So we'll share the recording. We will ask you to read and share the report. Make sure as many people see it as possible, especially policymakers within your region or your country, because this is fundamental to economic and societal development. We're also going to say, follow 𝗃𝗃, follow us on LinkedIn. It's where we do a lot of work. And my final message is, become part of the conversation. Bring your voice by becoming a member of 𝗃𝗃. It's a really important thing that we do together, and it's a pleasure to work with our members every single day. So I say thank you once again to everybody that came and everybody that contributed, and we'll see you online sometime in the future. Thank you very much indeed. Bye.